Hello and welcome back to the How to Be Good podcast. As you can see and you'll hear, today unfortunately I'm on my own. Anchor has not been well of late and so was unable to help me along with this one. So you're going to have to put up with my dulcet tones, unfortunately. However, this episode that we've got coming up for you it's a really big thing. So it's with Stop Ecocide International. Now, the word ecocide has been bounded about quite a lot lately, and it seems to be something that more and more people are starting to talk about. However, this person, Jojo Mehta, who is one of the key founders of this Stop Ecocide International, we speak to her and we talk about how big the ramifications of this could be. If ecocide is passed as a law, it has huge impact, massive impact globally. So let's get to it. Let's listen to Jojo Mehta and unfortunately just only me. Hello and welcome to the How to Be Good podcast. Today I am with Jojo Mehta, who is the Chief Executive and founder of Stop Ecocide International. Hello and how are you?
I'm really well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. So before we go and talk too much early on about ecocide, which I really do want to understand, it's such a huge thing. I want to understand how you got involved. How did it all start from you for your side of things?
That's going back a few years. I came to this from the environmental campaigning side of things. So I was very involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK.
Yeah.
A community which I know is very live, also has been in Australia as well. We've been very inspired by some of the things that the community has achieved, as well as obviously watching with horror as the industry makes its way in on your continent, which is really disturbing.
I think they gave license to 1,900 new fracking sites just last month, which is horrendous. But anyway, I digress.
Oh my goodness! Yeah. But this is and actually in the UK it was a battle of many years to reach the stage that we're at now, which is a kind of a sort of a moratorium, I guess.
Yes.
There's nothing currently going on, and a lot of that was very much down to direct community action. So so definitely. I suppose a success story of a sort, and one that was also inspired by, for example, things like the Bentley effect and so on in Australia. And I actually first encountered Polly Higgins, who was a UK barrister and legal pioneer, really, who became one of my dearest friends. And her name is probably most associated with this whole concept of ecocide, as she sort of really brought it back into the public domain within the last sort of decade or so. She's sadly no longer with us. She actually passed away after a short, very aggressive cancer in 2019.
Sorry.
But we met in the context of that work around fracking, because she moved to our area, which is and I live in the beautiful west of England in the Cotswolds, in a small town called Stroud, which is actually gaining a certain amount of reputation, because it's not only the sort of the birthplace of the Stop Ecocide movement, as it is now, but also of Extinction Rebellion. It was also born here. So, so Polly was moving to this area back in 2014, I believe, and she was working at the time on putting materials together around a potential case on fracking. And some mutual friends put us in touch, and they said, you need to speak to Jojo about this, because she knows all about this. So we met, and it was one of those kind of kindred spirit moments. Within kind of half an hour of sort of, talking about working together and sharing research and so on, there was this kind of moment of, you really work like I do. There was a kind of think fast, talk fast, act fast. It was an amazing moment. And I guess we really worked together ever since then. And what we collaborated on was actually launching a public facing campaign to support the work around criminalizing serious harm to nature. And that whole discussion was something that Polly had already dedicated several years to when we met. And I mean, I suppose I first encountered that work in the form of, I think, an article back in 2011 or 2012. And I remember reading about this idea of criminalizing ecocide and thinking, well, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, that's the biggest game in town. You know, you go to the guys that are causing all the damage, you say, sorry, you're not allowed to do that anymore.
Yeah. It's such a huge thing. I think this is, I've spoken to a few people about it just recently, and they were unaware as such. But then, like you, it was very much, that's so obvious. Why aren't we there? Why hasn't it been done already? Which obviously leads to a huge question.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it is one of those things that when you speak to somebody about it one-on-one, you know, I mean, I've yet to encounter anybody in a one-to-one conversation who doesn't think it's a good idea to make ecocide a crime.
Yeah,
you know, and as you say, and a lot of people are, you know, like, well, I didn't, you know, isn't this a crime already? So, you know, there is a kind of no-brainer quality to it. And on that, you know, on that score, it does sometimes feel like the easiest campaign in the world because, you know, we rarely have to persuade anybody very hard. But where the questions always come is, you know, the how, the what exactly, the, you know, all of those kinds of things. So, you know, and of course you know, it's a huge thing. I mean, the aim specifically of our campaign is to tackle this at the international level, to effectively kind of activate this law by engaging, you know, whether it's grassroots, politicians, diplomats, NGOs, you know, across the spectrum in support of making this an international crime at the International Criminal Court. And I mean, there are a few reasons for aiming for that particular route. I mean, I'm happy to go into those now, or if you've got anything else that you want to sort of look at in more general terms, I can do that.
I'm really keen to understand that, because obviously there's currently 4 international crimes, and this would be the 5th. And obviously, most people, I guess, are aware of war crimes. That seems to be have the most news and coverage and most knowledge through the people that I've spoken to before. But if you could describe what would be the key benefit, obviously it's probably a bad word, what would be the biggest impact of having this as an international crime?
I think, I mean, ultimately, we believe that, in a sense, potentially the most long-term, most important potential impact of criminalising serious harm to nature at the international level is actually a normative one. So it's this concept that, or it's a sense, if you like, that criminal law in our kind of global paradigm that is currently dominant, so it's the kind of one that's come through the Western canon, if you like, is that we kind of use criminal law to draw moral lines. And, you know, I mean, for example, you're not going to go to a government and say, can I have a permit to, you know, kill a few hundred people for my next business? I mean, you're just not going to do that. It's not even going to enter your head. It's so accepted that, you know, killing people is a taboo, and it's not just a criminal, but it's also morally wrong, right? And those crimes that already exist at the international level, so those are currently genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and more recently added the crime of aggression. You know, all of those have that, you know, kind of very obvious sort of moral aspect to them. And, you know, a kind of like the sort of ultimate expression of what, you know, at the more sort of, you know, singular level is something like murder, for example, or torture. But with ecocide, with damage to the natural world, we don't yet put it in that bracket. We don't, you know, you can go to a government and ask for a permit to, you know, frack or to drill for oil and gas, or to, you know, engage in industrial fishing of, you know, certain kinds of industrial fishing, destroy whole swathes of the seabed. You know, there are kind of, we effectively license this kind of destruction rather than forbidding it. And of course, there is always the fact that, you know, any human activity, you know, the production of food, you know, transport, all of these things often involves some kind of compromise of the environment. I mean, we simply wouldn't be able to, you know, society would not be functional as it is without some of that happening. So it's a question of identifying where, you know, where that line is drawn, and the introducing as a kind of almost as a moral concept, serious harm to the environment is actually bad and wrong per se.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just a question of, you know, how that might impact a certain group of people, although that has, you know, that is ultimately included in that as well. But at the moment, in most of our law focuses on property and on damage to people. There is, of course, an environmental body of environmental law that has been built up, but relatively recently, over the last 3 to 4 decades.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still not taken anything like as seriously as some other aspects of law. And we encounter this quite a lot in our sort of position as kind of dealing with the public narrative and people communicating with us from various different kind of areas, walks of life, and NGOs and activists and so on. We often hear, you know, this activity is already, strictly speaking, illegal, this destructive activity in a given situation, for example, but it's not being enforced. And, you know, companies might be receiving a slap on the wrist, might be receiving a fine. But this sense that serious destruction is actually kind of taboo is just not there. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way that making ecocide an international crime has the potential to start shifting that. You know, if you're going to put it alongside genocide, then you're kind of saying, destruction of the environment at a serious level is as bad as destruction of people.
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing is that with this severe and very prevalent destruction of the planet and our environment, the result is often early death. It is illnesses. It is, and that's on the human level, let alone the animals and the wildlife and everything else like that. That's completely obliterated by what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, the ultimate effect is hugely impacts humans, and ultimately impacts kind of civilization as we know it. You know, if we all kind of already know, and particularly given the IPCC report that came out last week, you know, just having that said at such a stark, you know, with such stark clarity, you know, what obviously some scientists have been telling us for some time, but just making it that clear and that obvious. It's very clear that you know, the impacts on human life are very severe. But I think what I mean, it was interesting because as you no doubt know, and it'd be great for your listeners to understand, one of the things that our foundation did recently was to convene a panel of top international criminal lawyers and environmental lawyers, actually all come from different backgrounds, but different parts of the world as well, very geographically diverse and diverse in terms of backgrounds and genders as well. So really, really credible panel of top lawyers to look at legally defining ecocide, because one of the things we've been asked so many times over the years is, what exactly do you mean by that? You know, what is and what isn't ecocide? And so having an independent panel work on that for a number of months and come up with a definition has been a sort of core part of that journey. And, you know, one of the things that they debated right at the beginning was, you know, are we looking at adapting, say, crimes against humanity to include an environmental element, or are we looking at a standalone crime? And that it actually wasn't too difficult a conversation in that group. Everyone was clear that actually what was needed here was a standalone crime, because you had to not be depending on harm to humans in order to criminalize damage to nature. And, you know, the fact that the damage to nature ultimately would also create damage to humans it remains the case, but it enabled a bit of a more ecocentric perspective to come in. And again, this kind of reflects a kind of a move towards a rebalancing, because, you know, again, in the kind of Western thinking tradition, there's this deeply embedded sense of separation from nature. It's very deeply embedded. And it goes right back to Plato, runs through the Catholic Church, you know, spirit versus body. You know, you can just go straight through to the Enlightenment with kind of reason versus nature. You know, that duality is there the whole way through. So it's kind of unsurprising in a way that we've ended up with an economy that functions the way it does and treats nature as this kind of, you know, resource to extract. But I think what this also does, what the Ecocide conversation also does, is it gives a bit of a reality check on that, because you know, we all know that you cannot extract you know, unlimited resources from a finite resource. It just doesn't work. So there's a way in which this is also a kind of a reality check.
So what, if it's able to be said in brief, what is the definition that came to by all the people that helped to come up with this legal definition?
Yeah, it's surprisingly easy to convey, because one of the beauties of it was that the consensus that they arrived at was actually hugely concise. And so what they defined ecocide as is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood that either that severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment will be caused by those acts. And that's it. I mean, there's then an explanatory paragraph about what is intended by severe, what is intended by widespread, etc. But that core definition is really quite concise, and
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's very good, because everybody can get it when it's that straightforward and concise. There's no room for maneuver, which is good.
I think that's very important, because I mean, and also you can contrast it with environmental regulation, which is often very detailed and very kind of precise about numbers, and that's something that the drafting panel avoided completely, because you need to be able to, and I mean, this is often the case with criminal law. I mean, if you think about it, if you get, I don't know, beaten up on the street, you know, what happens in terms of the court deciding whether that's grievous bodily harm, actual bodily harm, you know, attempted murder, you know, it doesn't depend on the exact number of bruises. It depends on the context, on the intent, on, you know, the surrounding kind of reasonable, you know, evidence and where that reasonably points to. So I think, you know, the fact that was avoided, you know, that putting too much precision in there was avoided, is in keeping with the criminal law approach generally, but it also enables, you know, judges to potentially take in context, you know, a particular case. I think what's probably important is to kind of grasp that there are two thresholds within that definition. Okay. And that's actually really important for how that lands in the political arena, but also how it lands with all of those people who are working to improve environmental law and best practice and all of those things, from activists to NGOs to scientists and so on. And that's that, you know, you have this one threshold, which is, you know, the act has to be likely to cause this severe damage, severe and either widespread or long term. And the other threshold is that the act has to be unlawful or wanton. Now, if it's unlawful, clearly, you know, there's already a problem. You know, you're breaching a regulation, or you're, you know, there's something. But this takes it to another level. It's saying that, you know, if what you're doing is unlawful and likely to create all this harm, you're actually potentially committing an international crime. So what that does is it strengthens the existing edifice of environmental law, and gives it a kind of a more serious sort of foundation, if you like. But it also enables the law to kind of mesh in with existing laws, which can vary from country to country, obviously. So something that's lawful in one country may not necessarily be lawful in another. And politically, that's important, because what you're not doing is you're not jumping in and just sort of jumping on everybody's toes and saying, well, whatever you said before, this is now illegal, which, of course, is what I went in there thinking would be great. You know, and I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there that would want to do that. Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, what it does is it also empowers all of those people who are working to improve regulation and improve the law, because as that progresses, and it's really important that those, you know, that expertise, that on the ground knowledge, and all of that is constantly pulled forward, if you like, by this definition, because what it's saying is that everything that you can work to improve is going to be backed up by this law. As you as the law improves, and as our perception around, you know, best practice in relation to our, you know, our interactions with nature, as that evolves, this law will become more effective and stricter and better over time. So that is actually really important. And then, of course, the wanton aspect catches those cases where something may be legal, but actually the effects are disproportionate, as in it's disproportionately nasty what's being done. So and that's where it kind of brings in a bit of a balancing act, because that's kind of interesting. Criminal law tends to be very cut and dried. Environmental law tends to be quite a bit amorphous and involve kind of lots of principles and not too many strict prohibitions, because of course there's always this balancing between, you know, what are the social and economic benefits, and, you know, what are the downsides. And it's when you're then looking at, I mean, you could be looking, for example, in developing countries that might not have the same strictness of environmental regulation, but where you could potentially nevertheless point to a case and say, well, look, the effects you're creating here are wildly out of proportion to the benefits that are going to be gained by the community or by the, by society. And that's where that aspect comes in. And I think what's been amazing about that definition is it really seems to have kind of hit a sweet spot in terms of a balance between, genuine protection from the worst harms and a kind of contextual flexibility within existing legal frameworks. And that has, I believe, led to the really quite positive response that we've had both in the press but also at the political level. So, it's actually seems to have landed quite well as a starting point for this, for this initiative at the international level. So that's very encouraging.
Absolutely. So with the countries, or some of the countries wanting to sign up to this, there's obviously, you have to get, is it 2/3 or something like, I probably got it wrong, 2/3 of the countries to have signed up to before it could get ratified or something like that. You would know that way better than me. I'm just trying to remember some of the research. But how many countries are looking like they are going to sign up to this, that it's going to be real and tangible?
This is really exciting, actually, at the moment to be watching this. I mean, in a way, this initiative is still near its beginnings, but over the last sort of 18 months, what we've seen is there are now 14 countries that are members of the International Criminal Court that are discussing this in some way, at parliamentary or government level, which has moved from kind of zero, pretty much, and which is amazing. The process is effectively that a state or a group of states, and we would aim for the latter, potentially a small group of states, can propose an amendment to the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the International Criminal Court. And then, a simple majority can kind of put it on the table. And at that point, then you enter into kind of negotiation discussion, which can take some time. And then you need, as you said, you need 2/3 of member states of the International Criminal Court to be behind it in order for it to be adopted, at least 2/3. And that means currently that's 82 states, which sounds like a lot, but given the speed of this, the growth of this conversation, we don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that we're looking at a timeline of around 4 to 5 years potentially to get this to the stage where countries can begin to ratify it. I mean, the other thing to say is that, as with all diplomatic work, what you see publicly is not necessarily where things are at, because of course we can't say until a state is talking about it publicly, we can't say they're talking about it, because that would be insane and it would totally scupper anything the conversations. So what you can kind of be assured of is that if there are that many countries talking about it publicly, there's a whole bunch more interested in this conversation. So, this is something that is progressing quite fast. The formal stages have not been entered into yet. We think that's still a little premature. I mean, that said, my goodness, we didn't expect, for example, the UK upper chamber to be discussing Ecocide, which it did last month. If you'd have asked us a year ago, that would have felt so pie in the sky. We wouldn't have even gone there. So, things are definitely accelerating. So, one never knows. But we would love to see a small group of countries ready by next year, potentially, to move this forward at the International Criminal Court. What is really encouraging, actually, is that what we're finding in these conversations is that even people that we might think of as not necessarily likely to want to support it are nonetheless seeing it as something that's inevitably on its way.
It's very hard to go, actually, no, I don't agree with that publicly. Sure, I don't know how somebody could publicly go, well, that's a daft idea, I'm not going to follow that. It's kind of political suicide, surely.
Well, this is what this really works in the favor of I mean, there's a couple of things here that really work in the favor of this initiative. So one is exactly what you say. People, I mean, this is interesting because I got asked actually at a talk I gave not long ago, what do you think about all this awful greenwashing that's going on? I said, okay, I'm going to say something really controversial here. I love greenwashing. Why do I love greenwashing? Because, the big oil and gas companies, for example, have spent the last 20 to 30 years putting across the idea that they're actually green. Are they now going to say, no, Ecocide's a really bad idea? No, that would destroy 20 years of PR. Of course they're not going to do that. And actually
BP's logo would be ruined.
Exactly. So, in a way, it works in the favour of, us moving this forward, that people are just going to look a bit crap if they, if they're objecting to this in public. And I mean, I don't think we're quite at that point with governments yet, but we're clearly verging on it, getting to the point where actually, governments are actually just going to be embarrassed to say that they think this is a bad idea.
Absolutely.
And that's a nice place to be. That's a nice place to be.
Yeah. So taking it further, let's look into hopefully the not too distant future, and it's gone through, it's ratified. What would be, I guess, the general prosecution process, and who would that be? Because under war crimes and things like that, and that's kind of the reference at the moment, and perhaps not the best one, but you wouldn't be going and prosecuting. If we were to talk about the war with Germany and things like that, you wouldn't be going and prosecuting every person that was putting people onto a train, and every person that you'd be going for the heads of and the people that know. Is it exactly the same type of setup?
Yeah, it's exactly the same. So just as with, as you implied, as with genocide, you wouldn't be prosecuting foot soldiers, you'd be prosecuting the controlling minds, so the generals or those at the top. The same would be the case with ecocide. So you would not be, for example, prosecuting someone for driving a fossil fuel car. You might potentially be prosecuting a government official who is at the key decision-making point of signing into being a policy which they know is going to create a certain level of environmental destruction or climate disruption, for example. I mean, that could arise. Or for example, you might be looking at somebody, a company official who has given the okay to a situation that either leads to an industrial disaster, like, I don't know, Fukushima or Deepwater Horizon, where there was either safety protocols or design recommendations that weren't followed. As in, at some point, somebody said, no, we're not going to do that, even though we know that we're going to make it. So, those kinds of things. So that's what you're ultimately aiming at. And it is individuals. So you're not aiming at corporations. You're not aiming at governments. You're aiming at people who are making decisions. And actually, that's really important. It's really important because, there's already, in fact, there was a Colorado University study that sort of showed, almost exactly this, that when you change regulation, you don't really see changes in behavior. What you see is changes in budgeting, or effectively, or
insurance protocols.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas when you actually start employing criminal law, you start to see behavioural change, because when somebody has actually got to think about their own personal freedom being on the line, if they make a certain decision or that goes the wrong way, then they're going to think much more carefully about that. It seriously concentrates the mind. And there's also a way in which, I mean, I found this particularly interesting. I was on a financial podcast recently, and the interviewer just kept trying to somehow get me to identify exactly where that fine line was that a company could approach but not quite go over. But actually, when you're talking about individual criminal responsibility, you're not talking about that kind of attitude, because no decision maker is going to sit there and go, how can I almost commit genocide but not quite? You're just not going to go there, because you don't want to be in the wrong. So although the exact line is contextual and maybe so, but you're just not going to approach it, because you don't want to be in that position. So that's the aim of this kind of individual criminalization, if you like, is creating that kind of concentration of the mind in terms of deterrence.
Yeah. And so I guess two parts to this question. So we would look, and I could easily point out a number of people around the world right now, and political leaders as well, that I would say potentially falls on that area, being kind. So firstly, would that individual person, let's say it was a head of state, that said, I don't care what the evidence says, I don't care what damage it's going to do, I'm going to give license to these new coal mines, these new gas mines, I'm going to frack the hell out of this place, and I was very close to saying something else, and the chips fall where they may, is that person then individually potentially going to be prosecuted?
I think the whole sense is precisely that of having somebody who's in the position to make those decisions, and it has to be once this law is in place. Let's bear in mind that the criminal law isn't retroactive. Okay,
it would be great if it was retrospective,
yeah, well,
but I know it can't be.
I know. I mean, there's one could say that, but then of course that way kind of crazy fascistic dictatorship lies as well. So in terms of in a sort of rule of law terms, but effectively what you want is for somebody to be saying, is this decision, is the knowledge there to show that this decision I'm going to make, is substantially likely to cause that harm, in which case, potentially, yes, that could be a context for an ecocidal prospect. However, let's also realize that this is, there's often a strong focus around what will happen when this is in place. And actually, we don't want, in our ideal world, nobody's in that dock, and nobody's in that dock because everybody's seen it coming. And actually it's become an incentive or a safety guardrail and a guidance system to take us all in a new direction. Because, this is not about ultimately, much as having come from the activist background myself, I might have enjoyed or wanted to give you a short list of people to demonize and punish. Ultimately, it's not about that because, regardless of the considerable inequalities, insane inequalities that exist economically and in terms of, standard of living and all of those things in different parts of the world, we are ultimately all on this one planet.
Yeah.
So in one way you could say we are all on this one boat. And if you point to the other end of the boat, which might be might be a company or it might be a country, and you say, well, the leak's at your end, doesn't really work. So exactly. The whole point of, for us anyway, one of the main points of aiming for something at the international level that is going to take time, but it's going to bring everybody with you, or enough of the world to make it a really key sort of shift into a new direction. Part of the whole point is having that time. Even obviously, we don't want it to be too long because there isn't too long to act around this, and clearly the goodwill and the ambition that have taken us this far are not enough. But there needs to be some time. There needs to be some time in order for the corporate world, for the political players to catch up, and it is always the politicians that are the laggards. Actually business will move quite fast if you give it the right steer. Exactly. So it's all about creating that expectation, and actually I would say it's already approaching that kind of certainty that something like this is on the way. And how do we approach that in the most constructive way? And I like to think of it as actually almost not just a stick, but also a carrot, because, and following the food metaphor, we had this cookery program in the UK that I like to use as an example. It was really big in the 90s. It was called Ready, Steady, Cook.
Oh, yes.
And
I remember that.
Do you remember it? And, yes. What would happen is, these chefs would go on and they'd be given this kind of, you'd have a time limit and a set of unexpected ingredients, and you then had to make a beautiful dish in that time, and that's the attitude that we want people to be taking to this. Yes, when it comes to it, there will be prosecutions. There's no doubt that once this law is in place, but what we want is for everybody to be looking at that as a kind of a safety rail and a parameter and saying, well, actually, we can't be continuing to do those activities. We already know this. And so having a rule in place that levels the playing field, that means that if we do the right thing, if we do the beautiful thing, we are not going to be disadvantaged in relation to, others who want to carry on with the old dirty protocol, ways of doing things, then that actually gives those people a chance to be creative and innovative. And, I myself spent time as an entrepreneur, and, there's nothing like a clear parameter for unleashing the creativity, and the same is true of, good God, the same is true of poetry. You say write a sonnet, that kind of, okay, I've got this form and I need to create this beautiful thing within this form, and so there's something about that approach that I think is going to be really important in this. That's going to enable us to kind of bring the whole world with this,
Absolutely. No, I trained as an architect and and still work as an architect every now and again. And I can completely understand what you mean about the parameters. The biggest trouble I ever had with projects were the ones that were way too open-ended.
Yeah.
And so having those parameters gives you the guideline, gives you the work, and gives the best results. So I'm completely with you on that, and I think that's the best way forward. on your website, I had a look at, okay, what could be the benefits of the law being passed and things like that. And a number of things, it could be that some things are classified as ecocide. So it could be industrial fishing or plastic pollution or deforestation, mineral extraction, palm oil extraction, and many, many others. What I'm trying to understand is that there is going to be a degree where this is going to have to continue in many areas, and yes, there's many areas we can do vastly better and not have to, deforestation and so forth. But how is it defined? What's ecocide? Is it the wanton destruction or harm how is that going to be,
how is that balanced,
worked out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're going to be looking at, I mean, firstly, because it's at the international level, you are going to be looking at the most serious cases of harm.
Yes.
So it's not going to include everything.
Mm-hmm.
And what we believe it will encourage is obviously for what might be termed a lesser degree of environmental destruction will become better regulated over time and actually tighten that gap, if you like. Yeah. But initially what you're looking at is the most sort of severe cases that are, they're either transboundary or they go beyond a certain geographic area, or they affect an entire species or an entire ecosystem or a large number of human beings. Those are the kinds of elements that have been detailed in that definition as sort of fitting that term of widespread, for example. And with severe, you're also looking at potential, for example, serious cultural harm as a result of environmental damage. And that's really important because that really brings in the respect for indigenous cultures, and the cultural and spiritual approach to land and to home, if you like. And I think the home side of this is very interesting as well, because actually ecocide as a word etymologically means to kill one's home. And so there's something about kind of perceiving the planet as our home, but also our landscapes in which we are rooted as where we live as also home, and recognizing that, and this is where it really kind of brings in the kind of social and racial justice and climate justice side of things, because with the environmental destruction that's going on may not be happening to our personal home, but it's still happening to the home landscapes of those in other countries, where the extractive activity potentially is going on. And also there's also this sort of ironic situation where it's just the truth. I mean, in the sense that 80% of the world's greatest biodiversity is in areas that are, where the indigenous communities are guardians of that land, if you like, or of that way of life. So there's something about bringing in that cultural aspect that is very important. And there's also something about, actually, and this is interesting, I think, something about inserting ecocide into the Rome Statute, which is a document that governs the International Criminal Court, which itself could be argued to be an expression of colonial domination on one level. It's set in Western Europe. Those who've been prosecuted mostly been African warlords, whatever. But what you're actually looking at with ecocide is that the decisions that lead to the ecocidal activity are actually mostly taken in the wealthy north. So you're potentially looking at a certain rebalancing there and a redressing of who's being targeted. And you're also looking at a situation where the wealthy north has the financial wherewithal and the influential wherewithal to be turning into a new, to be shifting towards a new direction that's actually positive. I mean, there's an example of an oil company in, I think it was Norway. I must go look up again the name of the company, but they shifted from being one of the biggest oil and gas producers to being one of the biggest renewable energy producers, in the sense that there was an actual active decision. I mean, you've got all of that infrastructure there, you've got all of the relationships there, you're an energy producer. It's like, okay, just produce your energy differently. And similarly, we could be looking at, for example, aid that is going to developing countries actually specifically supporting transition technology, transition approaches and policies. And this law could be an, really supportive factor in that. So I do think that there are some really potentially interesting aspects that cross over into the kind of social and climate justice side of things as well.
Absolutely, it's incredibly wide-reaching as to how far this could go. As I said at the start, it's huge. It really is huge how big this could be, and what an enormous effect this could have. How are you finding the reaction of, I guess, our favourite friends at the fossil fuel lobbies and industrial agriculture and industrial fishing? Have they kept reasonably quiet simply because they wouldn't dare say, no, I'm not into that? Or
I think I mean, there's certainly been no public objections, and I think that is very much for that reason. I mean, I remember when I got involved with the campaign, I mean, years ago, before I got into the Ecocide side of things, against a local incinerator. Now, incineration is one of these things that's just starting to get a bit of airtime now as to how polluting it actually is, and how much it supports that kind of extractive linear economy. And at the time, there was relatively little research around that, but it was, and I remember actually talking with Polly, who was still around then, and we were just starting to work together. She said, you know what? You don't have to worry about those companies actually coming out publicly against you, because they will be talking to their lawyers, and their lawyers will be saying, do not touch her with a barge pole, because anything you say will be made a massive meal of in the media. And so, that's exactly the situation writ large that we have now. So there's that side of it. However, I mean, and we haven't actually had any specific conversations around the fishing industry, which is one of the ones you brought up. But I think there's an interesting, I mean, for example, in agriculture, I mean, there is an interesting move towards, I mean, there's still obviously going to be these really huge companies that are into this kind of monocropping and so on. But I certainly can, from speaking from the UK perspective, the whole concept of regenerative agriculture is actually starting to be listened to, even in the more conventional farming world, because it simply produces better results. And so I think this is very interesting. I think sort of in parallel with this legal discussion, we're also seeing some really kind of quite positive things emerging that don't yet have the traction that they could have if this parameter was in place. And I think that's going to be a factor as well. But we are actually seeing the approach of sort of, I say new techniques, but in some ways, some of them are age-old techniques, but that are potentially more person intensive, which actually is great for jobs, really great for jobs, but also better for the land and ultimately more productive. So, and I think it's interesting, for example, that if you look back to, I think it was 2016, there was a UN food and farming report that came out. I think is it the FAO? Anyway, their conclusion was that, yes, we actually can feed 9 billion people on this planet. But if we're going to do that, the way to do it is by farming locally with local techniques that are suited to local landscapes, which actually sounds to be not a million miles from the permaculture approach. So, that sort of body of knowledge is already there, and is beginning to sort of be discussed with more, at the more mainstream end of things. I mean, all of this, of course, is not happening fast enough, and that's one of the things that we see this law as potentially doing, is accelerating all of that.
Absolutely.
But so I think that there are transformative things happening across industry, but they're not happening from the center. It's always the case. They're happening from the margins, and they're gradually, and it's that thing of, first they ridicule you, then they argue with you, and then they tell you, well, they already knew all along that what you were saying.
Frustrating but true.
Absolutely.
So with these sort of I guess the lobbies and lobbyists and so forth, are you seeing any sort of misinformation campaigning or anything like that? Fortunately, or are they too busy trying to still get coal and gas extracted at the moment, rather than say that that's okay?
I think this is interesting, and I think we'll be able to answer that question better a little bit further down the line, in the sense that this is because it's still a fairly new conversation. I think we're probably yet to see the sort of major resistance appearing. But like I said, I mean, I do think we have an extraordinary we're extraordinarily helped by the concept and the word itself in this. And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. We talked about people not wanting to publicly come out and object to it. The other side of that is that the word itself has a certain power. So people have an awareness that there's serious damage to nature happening in many different areas. And this word ecocide kind of brings all that together. And people, you can see people, and we have it all the time. We see people have this kind of clunk moment of like, oh my God, of course, this is all serious harm to nature. This is all ecocide. Yeah. And of course, as soon as you get the word, you have an instant moral response to it. Yeah. So just the word itself creates its own momentum. And that so that's really interesting, and that I think is working very much for us. And I think it also sets it apart from some of the other solutions, which might be wonderful, but don't have that particular element. So, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, an easy example might be something like there's been a UN treaty that's been being discussed for some years. I think it's still at its draft 0 phase, and it's on transnational corporations and taking responsibility for human rights violations and effects on the environment. As you can see, that took quite a long while for me to say it, and I'm still not sure that that's the title. And it's generally referred to as the legally binding treaty, which tells you absolutely zero about what it does. Whereas when you talk about ecocide, people go, oh, that ecocide thing. Oh my God, ecocide. It has its own...
It's so succinct that it's easy for everybody to grasp, which is fantastic, which everybody needs. It is good. So how can me personally, my wife, everybody that we know, listeners, but everybody generally, how can we help this? How can we push it forward even quicker?
I think that, there are a number of actions that people can take, and we would obviously invite people to go to our website, which is stopecocide.earth, where there's a whole Act Now menu with a whole range of things that you can do. And of course, this is all about, we are really treating this as a global conversation. So the more this word is being discussed and the more this concept is being discussed, the faster the political wheels move. So what we would say is talk about it, not just talk about it with your mates, talk about it with your mates, of course, do that, but think strategically about, where is my voice going to reach the most people? So if you happen to, it could be anything from, you're a mechanic and, you have a notice board that you're all exchanging things on about, you mention it there, it could be anything. It could be, whatever your particular network is. And we all do have networks, and they can be big, they can be small, and it doesn't matter if it's, it doesn't appear to be directly related to climate or to the environment, because this is something that ultimately affects all of us. Yeah. So using the word, talking about it, and of course, bending the ear of elected representatives about this concept. That's always ultimately going to be the goal. But the other thing is that, we have, for example, we have an international manifesto that's been taken, and that's also been done more specifically in specific countries. So Spain and Germany have already done this, where they've got, they've had the manifesto in their language, and they've asked NGOs and groups and organizations, including companies, to support it. And that then gives you something to move forward with at the government level to say, we've got people in support of it. We do have a branch in Australia. We have a campaign team, communications team in Australia. So we would say absolutely, get in touch with them. But the key, the bottom line about this is talk about it, shout about it, and create those opportunities for people to learn more about it, because people do often have very specific questions, as you've had over the course of this. So we're always open to opportunities to address audiences and of course train people up to do that as well. So that's
fantastic. There's a lot of things people can do to get this out there, and I think that they will, because it's so easy to grab onto. We always ask everybody that we interview a couple of quick questions at the end, and sometimes they can lead on to other things. But so, understanding the climate emergency, what keeps you up at night?
That's interesting, isn't it? Now, when working with something like we do, which is just so massive scale, I couldn't possibly sleep if it was the climate crisis that kept me awake at night. I mean, it would just be, because it's my all day, every day. I tell you what, I mean, I think if anything keeps me up at night, it's usually to do with relationships. So if there's something that's not working, either in the team or in my personal life, where there's something and it's always when there's some lack of clarity or lack of transparency, or something feels like it's on shaky ground or something like that. Yeah. Those are the sorts of things that keep me up at night, because when you're working with a team and you're wanting to sort of move things forward in a coherent way, that it's there's got to be a kind of coherence and a transparency and a mutual support. So and I'm glad to say that it doesn't happen often at all.
Good.
I feel very blessed to be able to sleep in almost all circumstances, given the chance.
Oh, that is a gift. That is a gift.
and believe me, with the working hours I do, I need that ability.
So what makes you optimistic for the future?
Gosh, I mean, to be honest, it's seeing the potential that, all the people that we speak to, knowing that, do you know what? I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest untapped resource that we have globally is the imagination and intention, combined with the skills, obviously, but of individual people. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not really brought up in our culture. We're not educated or acculturated, if you like, to feel like we have personal agency. So people are often, sort of say to me, well, what can I just as, a little individual do? I'm like, you're not a little individual. I'm an individual too. I just decided that this is really important. I'm going to do this. We can all make those decisions. And, we had a conversation, my colleague had a conversation with her brother, who works in serious infrastructure, kind of substations for electricity under the sea, or one of these huge kind of huge projects like that. And he had all these direct questions when she talked to him about Ecocide. He had, well, how is this going to affect that? What about the budgeting for this? How will that work in the context of that? And it was amazing, because those are exactly the questions. Those are exactly the thinking exercises that everybody needs to be doing. Yeah. And it just I had this eureka moment listening to her talk about it, because I was just like, my God, this is this incredible untapped resource of all this knowledge. All you need to do is say to people, this is the parameter that's approaching. What needs addressing in your area? Yeah. And that untapped, that gives me huge hope. Just the knowledge that if we can unleash that, there's nothing we can't do. Everything on this planet that hasn't grown out of the ground is the result of human intention. Mm-hmm. So if we all get behind that, I mean, that's just an incredible, potential, and that always gives me hope. Fantastic.
So, is there anything, if you could ask our listeners anything to do, one thing to help the planet, what would it be? How could we be good? It's very hard when it's just one.
Well, yeah, but you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say talk about Ecocide.
And that's good. It is what they need to do.
And say that it's time that this was made a crime. That's what I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm very conscious that you're extremely busy and you have other meetings to go to. And thank you very, very much for your time.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a delight speaking with you.
Thank you. So that was Jojo, and it was such a pleasure to have her on the show. And we did discuss off of there that we will try and get Jojo on again. There's so much to talk about. There's so many more questions that I had, and I'm sure many more questions that you guys have had, but also to keep an update on where this is going, how the new law is going, and the effects that it could have globally. Obviously, as you probably well aware, it is an enormous thing. If we get this law passed, and I would really like you to go onto their website as well, stopecocide.earth, I think it is, but I'll check it in the show notes, and go on and sign their petition. Make your voice heard. It's really quick, really simple. But also keep the conversation going. Keep the word ecocide in people's mind. So it doesn't give the opportunity for key people in large businesses or governments or so forth to think that, we can get away with it. We can pay our insurance and it'll cover any issues and things like that. All of a sudden they could become liable. It's I see it as being one of the biggest things to stop the plundering of our planet and our environment, and to give us some hope that things will change. And even before the law comes in place, and I'm sure it will, I'm sure they're going to get this passed, but the thought that people will be held to account for this, I think is going to make people think twice before they do anything to plunder the earth and the environment anymore. Anyway, so thanks for listening to us, should I say. We, as ever, are self-funded, and it would be great if you could help us out. Go to our Patreon page or go to our website, and that's got a link to it there. The website is www.howtobegood.com.au. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.